Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hey everybody, welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, I'm Nick, and in this episode, I interview Ellen Stumbo, and Ellen and I talk about how churches can best serve families with disabilities, and it's a great conversation. She really shares a lot of helpful stuff about what it's like to be a parent with a child that has disabilities and to be in a church and their kind of journey with her husband as the pastor of a church, and then families who had kids with disabilities started to come because they felt like, you know what, this church is probably going to be able to help us because the pastor's family knows what this is like. And so I think the framework that she walks through is really helpful in terms of our understanding of connecting with families with disabilities and how we view them and how we serve them. And then the practical things she shares about what churches can do to better serve families to start from scratch, or even if you are serving families and you have something going that you're proud of. I just think she shares a lot of practical tips that are really helpful. So there's a bunch of links she'll talk about that are good resources to go to. And we put all of those and more in the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 59. But let's go ahead now and jump into my conversation with Ellen about serving families with disabilities. Well, today I'm joined by Ellen Stumbo. Ellen, welcome to the podcast.
It's so nice to be here.
Well, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself and your family?
Well, my husband and I have been married for 14 years, and he was a pastor for 13 of those years. He's now transitioning into becoming a counselor. And we have 3 girls, and 2 of our daughters have disabilities. Our youngest daughter was born with Down syndrome, and she kind of opened our eyes to a people group that we were probably not very aware of before, and quite honestly, not very interested to know more about, thinking that it had nothing to do with us. But she changed our life, she changed our ministry, and we adopted our middle daughter from Ukraine, and she has cerebral palsy. So there was a time that disability really had not much to do with our life, and now it kind of defines our life in some ways and has even come to define our ministry and what we have been involved in doing. So about 6 years ago, when my husband was at a new church, we were at a new church, the word got out that there was a new pastor who had 2 kids with disabilities. And what happened is that we started having families come to our church who had kids with disabilities and who had unfortunately had really negative experiences at church. And they were coming in the hopes that this would be a place where we would understand them, where they would be able to find connection, support, and no judgment, and especially where their kids would be welcomed. And also what happened is that we had quite a few adults with disabilities who started coming because their experiences at church, unfortunately, were those that they were not treated as people. And you would think that a church, that's a place where we treat people as people, but unfortunately, a lot of people with disabilities, what they experience at church is ignorance, a lot of pity, condescending behaviors, the way people talk to them, very low expectations, and not really looking at them as equals, which we recognized was a huge problem. So my husband and I started a ministry, and it's called Disability Matters. And our goal is to encourage every church to embrace disability. And our vision is really to see disability as an organic part of every church. So we started really working into making this a reality for as many churches as we could. And I've kind of taken the lead doing that. And I'm the one who travels and who speaks at churches and helps churches figure it out. But it's really been exciting to see how God has opened doors and how we have been able to go and really help churches get it and understand why disability matters within a church.
How about, I think that'd be great to talk about a little bit more. I think we all know it matters, but like you said, a lot of people's church experience is not a good one if they have a disability or children with disabilities. So why, I guess 2 questions in one. Tell us more about why this matters and why specifically you use the term disability ministry? Because a lot of times you will see in churches it might be called special needs or maybe something else. Sometimes they'll brand it with their own name. So there are a lot of different ways churches approach it, but you like to use that language specifically, right?
Absolutely. And there is a reason for that. So we can start with why I use the term disability and not special needs. It's as simple as that is what the disability community has asked us to use. And I've always said that if you have a people group who is self-identifying with a term, we are not the ones to say how they should be identifying themselves. So I don't know even one adult with a disability who does not cringe and feels offended when somebody uses the term special needs. Now, when it comes to parents, and because I'm the parent of kids with disabilities, we tend to use the term special needs a little bit more. And I used to refer to myself as a special needs parent, and I probably still do once in a while, but I have tried to change my language to a parent of kids with disabilities. And part of that is because I do have 2 children who belong to the disability community. And the people in their community are very clear about the terminology that they prefer. And I really feel that, especially when it comes to church situations, we should really honor the people who are telling us what they want to be called. And I have heard people say that they don't like the term disability because of the negative connotations that they feel from that. And adults with disabilities are saying, well, you might not feel comfortable about the term disability, but we do. And not only are we comfortable with the term, we feel very proud of it. So that's where working through our own disability attitudes is so important. So this is where we're going to jump into the why actually disability ministry matters. And there is an amazing tool that's called the 5 stages of disability attitudes. It was created by Dan Vanderplaat, and he works at Elam Christian Services. And this is a Christian organization servicing people with disabilities. And he walks people through 5 stages, and I'm going to do a mad dash through the 5 stages right now, okay? So are you ready?
Yeah,
okay.
We're ready.
Stage 1 is ignorance. That's where we don't recognize that there's a lot of people with disabilities. That's where maybe you're not aware. You might not even be aware of the need. It's not in your immediate experience. Maybe you don't know anybody with a disability. You don't have friends who have kids with disabilities. You just don't know a lot about it. So that's pity. That's ignorance. Then stage 2 is pity. Pity is when you look at people with disabilities and you think things like, wow, that must be so hard. I'm so glad my kids don't have a disability. It's looking at disability as a tragedy. Now, this is the stage that is the most commonly experienced by people with disabilities. And that is because pity is the most common disability attitude. So a way to think about it is if you have ever seen someone with a disability, let's say an adult, and you have probably either seen this interaction happen or you have done this, that you see an adult with a disability and you come over and you say, oh, hello, how are you doing? And you talk to that person like they were a child. Mm-hmm. It happens all the time. I have several friends who are adults with disabilities, and when we're out together, I cannot tell you of even one time where that did not happen. And I have been in situations where people ask me questions about them, or even situations where my friends are saying something about themselves. So for example, I had a friend who said, no, somebody was offering to do something for her. And she said, no, thank you. I'm fully capable. And the person who was offering just ignored her completely and continued trying to do what she had asked her not to do, which is so offensive. You know, people think, oh, I'm being so helpful. And even though they said, no, I'm going to help, but she said, no, thank you. And she said she was fully capable. And then I said, no, thank you. She is fully capable. And when I said it, the person offering help listened to me. And I thought there is a problem where my words about someone else matter more about that person's words about themselves. So that's pity. It's really looking at disability as something really bad, something really terrible. You're thankful it didn't happen to you. And it's when we imagine what disability is like and what we imagine is negative. That is pity. And again, it comes out in the way that we interact. It's the most common. So chances are, if you've never heard about disability attitudes, you've been there, you're there, I was there. And sometimes I go back to pity when there's a new situation, but I'm aware of it now, and hopefully I can move on to the next stage 3, which is care. Care is where you look at people with disabilities and you say, I can do something about it. So maybe there's challenges that people with disabilities live with, but there's something I can do about it. And this is the stage where we begin to see the heart of Christ. This is where we begin to see churches create a disability ministry or be open to receiving people with disabilities. Now, stage 4 is friendship. And this is a true friendship. This is where each person has something to give and each person has something to take. It's a back and forth. It's not a one way. It's not I'm being nice to my friend with a disability. It's they appreciate my friendship and I appreciate their friendship too. There's something I get out of this friendship. And I don't mean a feel good, pat myself in the back, because that goes back to pity. I mean a true friendship. We all want to be known, right? We all want to be accepted for exactly who we are. That's friendship. And you would think that friendship is the ultimate, but the 5th stage and the final stage is co-laboring. And that means when we really look at people with disabilities and we recognize that they are co-laborers in the kingdom, that they are invaluable members of the body of Christ. And they are not people that you do ministry for. These are the people you do ministry with. So that's the mad dash through the disability attitudes and the 5 stages of disability attitudes. So when I say why disability matters, you would think, yes, everybody understands disability matters, but I don't think we really do, because very few of us actually understand what co-laboring means and why it is not just something we should do, but why it is imperative that our churches have people impacted by disability.
And because I would imagine that you would agree that most churches are finding themselves somewhere in the first 3 stages. I mean, like probably in a very large percentage, like 98% or something of churches are probably somewhere in the first 3, either ignorant or pity, or maybe they are providing some level of care, but not getting to the stage 4 and 5.
Well, you're being very nice. Say including stage 3, but no. Unfortunately, most churches are in stage 1 and 2.
Yeah, which
most
even
common
within the
2.
3, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yes. When you see a church that has a disability ministry, then you know that they are at least at a stage 3. But very, very few churches even get to stage 4 and 5. And that's usually my challenge with churches when they're doing really well at stage 3, when they actually have a ministry for people with disabilities. My challenge is always, okay, you're doing a ministry to people with disability, to people with disabilities, but how are you doing friendship and how are you doing ministry with? Because everyone has gifts, everyone has talents, and church should be a place where everyone belongs and everyone serves and everyone is discipled, because that's what church should be. So again, because pity is the most commonly experienced disability attitude, it is the most common within churches as well. And unfortunately, we have taken scripture to almost reconcile our pity, to almost say that scripture supports pity. And that's a whole theological issue that we're not really talking about today. But when we really understand the theology of disability and what the Bible has to say about disability, it is not pity. It is co-laboring. And there is care, obviously, and friendship too. But yes, unfortunately, and I don't say this as something bad for church, because when you understand disability attitudes, every single one of us, all of us, we have to start at stage 1. We can't magically start in stage 3 or 5 because, and ignorance, I know it's bad, we don't like the word ignorance. We don't like to say we're ignorant, but ignorance means you just don't know.
Yeah.
And we all have to start there. And we all do have to move to pity. And again, pity is not a great word, but we do have to go through that because at least we start feeling a little bit. It's not just ignorant, but now I'm wrestling with my views and my ideas of disability. And once you wrestle, then you can move to care, then to friendship, then collaborating. And the thing with disability attitudes is that, again, when you get to stage 5, you haven't arrived and now you've got it. If you're an able-bodied person like I am, and that's what the disability community calls us, able-bodied or neurotypical. If you are able-bodied like me, I'm going to sometimes, again, in new situations, find myself in stage 1. And I found myself sometimes acting in ways that I recognize right away, wow, that's pity. And I shouldn't, be there. But it's part of the learning process. It's part of getting there. And again, if a church has not been aware of it, they haven't had any training, you can't expect the church to be at stage 5. So this is not to put down churches, because that's never, ever the purpose, of the 5 stages, or even to talk about disability ministry. More than anything is to understand the need and to understand why it is so important to get to stage 5 and then why disability matters.
And we were talking before we recorded, you mentioned a couple things about just how not important it is for everyone, but also how much how big the community is that the church is not reaching. We were talking about, well, how many, people struggle with disabilities, how many of those people are not involved in a church. And for a lot of them, it has nothing to do with belief in God. It's really about the church itself and the experience. That's why people came to your church once you and your husband arrived. There was this sense of like, well, they probably understand. And so if I go there, I'm probably going to belong. So tell us a little bit about what is the landscape, of people with disabilities and their involvement in churches.
So if you look at the U.S., okay, and you can Google this, 1 out of every 5 people has a disability. That's 20%, 1 out of every 5. And I usually say in my family, there's 5 of us and 2 of my kids have a disability. But if I ask you how many of us are impacted by disability, you would tell me,
all
of us. Yeah. So when you think about disability, it's not just the 20% that, are impacted by disability. It's their families as well. So some people even estimate that it could be close to 2/3 of the planet. I don't know because there's no, concrete statistics. But what we do know is that 20%, 1 out of every 5 people has a disability. And this is adults and this is kids. Now, the other thing that you and I were talking about was, what is disability? What encompasses disability?
Yeah.
Well, there are different things. When we talk about people with disabilities, we're talking about people with physical disabilities. We're talking about people with intellectual disabilities. We're talking about people with mental illness, actually, as well. They're included in that. We're talking about people with maybe autism or other neurological conditions that are not, quote unquote, typical. So all of that is included in disability. So there's a wide variety.
And you said, go ahead.
So if you think about it, you can be a church really prepared to receive people with physical disabilities, but maybe you don't really know how to handle someone who has mental illness. So, it's pretty wide and there's a lot of different components to that. And, then it's looking at what's a disability, the difference between disability and illness. And when I talk about illness, it's, for example, if you have cancer. So having cancer is not the same as having, let's say, cerebral palsy. And we seem as a church to support people going through illness better, with the exception of mental illness. We don't do a very good job at recognizing or accepting or knowing how to handle mental illness, which is a completely different topic that we could talk about, but we're not this time around. So there is a difference between what is an actual disability, something that you're born with maybe, or maybe even if you had an accident and you end up having a physical disability and being sick. Yes. There's a difference. So when we talk about the 20%, 1 out of every 5, now some disabilities are going to be invisible, and there's a reason why people talk about invisible disabilities, especially for a lot of people who have mental illness. So just because you're looking at church, you might not know that someone has bipolar or severe clinical depression or social anxiety, which actually they might not be at church if they have social anxiety. But if you look at your church, and even with kids, if you don't see that 1 out of every 5 people in your congregation have a disability, or close to 1 out of every 5, then obviously those families are missing. Now, why are people not at church? Different things. One, sometimes kids who have disabilities, they struggle with transitions and they struggle with things being different. And maybe Monday through Friday goes really well because it's school and it's always the same. But come the weekend, it can be really difficult and you're adding church to that. So for some families, getting their kids to church is more work than it's worth being there. Maybe they're going to church because they have gone to church and their child, rather than being in the children's ministry, they keep calling the parents and they say, we don't know how to deal with your child, or maybe your child is being disruptive in the sanctuary, and those parents end up sitting in the foyer. Now, what I say is anytime you see a parent sitting in the foyer, go sit with the parent. You don't even have to talk to them. Go sit with them, because why would you go to church if you're sitting in the foyer and you end up being by yourself? And the amount of special needs parents, see, I just said special needs. The amount of parents who have kids with disabilities who end up sitting in a foyer is so large that after a while, these parents are saying, why go through the effort if I end up being by myself? I'm just going to stay home. The other reason could be, and I unfortunately know of too many of the situations where the church, even before meeting the child, asks the family not to come to church, or they say that they're not equipped and they don't even know the child. I mean, the child could be doing really well in a children's ministry, even without a helper. Yeah. And I mean, I've had people send me the letters that they received, like the emails they received from a church that they had sent an email to inquiring about visiting their church. And it breaks my heart because I know that it's not God's heart. And I know that if my heart breaks, so does God's heart. And then you have adults with disabilities whose main experience at church has been that people, all they care about is to see them healed, or to suggest that perhaps their disability is a result of their sin. Oh, gosh. So if those are your experiences when you go somewhere, why would you keep going? So I have a friend who has a physical disability who was at a church, and they had, an altar call for people who needed prayer. And then they invited other people to go, and go and pray for those people. So she went there to pray for other people. But as soon as they saw she had a physical disability, people kept coming around and without asking, first of all, placing their hands on her legs. And who ever thought that it's a good idea for some man or even woman to touch a woman's legs without permission when they're a stranger? Yeah. I mean, if it happened in the street, you slap the person, you call the police. It is not okay to do at church. So that's just a side note. Yeah. But to have that it's such a scary experience, especially because, and I've had so many adults with disabilities say that I know able-bodied people think that I should be healed, but it's part of my identity. And I am happy with my disability. And I always think about it because I'm actually Mexican. I mean, can you imagine if people came and they said, oh, being Mexican is really terrible. We're going to pray for you so you're not Mexican anymore. I mean, you would say right now, it's ridiculous. I mean, Who would pray that? Well, it's hard for us to understand maybe when we're able-bodied, but for a lot of people with disabilities, especially adults with disabilities who have grown and come to terms with their disability, come to accept it and actually find great pride in their disability, it kind of feels that way. So, it's those experiences that could potentially keep people away from church. And unfortunately, you don't see a lot of adults with disabilities at church for that. And also because of transportation. Yeah. So if a person with a disability has no way to getting to church, then they just can't get to church. We had a van that picked up some people with disabilities, adults with disabilities, and we brought them to church. But I know that there were a lot more a lot more people that could have used a ride. So everyone, can do something to help those people get to church, really.
Yeah, like you just listed, there are a lot of barriers there. That's why you would agree, and I think most people would agree, that the disability community is like a higher percentage of them are not in church than able-bodied people, that community, for all these various reasons, even to the point where obviously you have tons of families who are Christian, have been part of churches in their past, but for the reasons you just listed are not a part of a church now. So how can churches help? What are some practical things that churches can do to include people with disabilities? And I know, the church size usually comes up here, but you kind of think that a smaller church it might have an advantage. They might do a better job of this than maybe the large church. But what can any church do to help include people with disabilities?
Well, the most important thing is to recognize that disability ministry is about relationship. It is actually not about a program. It's not about volunteers. It's about relationship. It's really about looking at people as people. So an example that I really love from a church is that they wanted to go and reach out to a group home with young men, a group home of, young men with disabilities. And the pastor said, we're looking for volunteers who can go to this group home so that we can reach out to young adults with disabilities. And only like 2 or 3 men actually came forward saying that they wanted to volunteer. So the next time, what the guy said was, we're looking for men who love the Green Bay Packers. So if you love the Green Bay Packers, this is in Wisconsin and I'm in Wisconsin. I want you to stay here after church so we can talk about some ideas that we have. So there were like 50 men who came, who stayed. And what the pastor said is, there is a group home of young men with disabilities, and they love the Green Bay Packers. And they would like us to go and watch the game with them. And that difference right there, that little connection made all the difference. Now, not all of them went, but I would say that out of the 50 men, probably 40 did end up going, because there was that connection. There was that relationship. It was not just go and volunteer. Because again, it's not about volunteers. It's about relationship. So they were going to go and hang out with other men and just watch a game. And that developed, into so many other opportunities and really great connections between the church. Or for example, if you have a man with a disability that comes to your church and maybe they keep talking about trucks and all they do is talk about trucks and that's all they care to talk about. And every time you see them, they say, hey, I have a truck, or hey, I saw a truck. And there's a man at your church who actually has a truck. So the best way right there when it comes to a relationship is to say, hey, Joe, you have a truck, right? Well, yeah, I have a truck. Well, here, Billy loves trucks. Could you show him your truck after the service? Right there. That's relationship. I mean, that is disability ministry. It's relationship. So when we think about what can we do to welcome people with disabilities, one, let's treat them like people. Let's love them. And let's find that relational connection that we can have with other people. If we treat people like people, they're going to want to come. If we find that relationship and we stop thinking about it as a ministry you do for someone, but an actual, again, the friendship aspect of that, it makes all the difference. Now, what I don't recommend is to say, we're going to start a disability ministry and we're going to put pamphlets and we're going to put signs all over, because there's been situations, and in some way, our church was kind of like that, where you could get too many families impacted by disabilities all at once, and then all of a sudden, everybody feels overwhelmed.
Sure.
So
it's almost like, I guess it's better to be organic with it. Maybe the church grows as the ministry grows together.
Yes. Yeah. Now, if a church is ready to do that, if you actually if you're equipped to do that, if you have the resources to do that, then by all means, go out and start your disability ministry big. But the reality is most churches don't. Sometimes the best way to start is you have one family, one child, and love them really well. And the reality is that that family is going to be talking to their friend at therapy, another family at therapy. And if church comes up, they're going to say, oh, you don't go to church? Come to my church. And then that family is going to come. And it gets out word of mouth. And let me tell you, word of mouth is powerful, because when people hear that your church is a church who loves and cares for families impacted by disability, people will come because the need is so great. Now, eventually, once you're servicing those few families really well, then you can then start expanding and doing more.
What does that look like for a church? Again, regardless really of size, but think of a church that is just starting. There's a few families or there's one family. What does it look like, do you think, to help serve those families well and then begin to grow that? Not down the road when they've been doing it for a while, but what's that early part look like? How do you, because I know one thing church leaders think about is, what do I do when we first meet them? Like, how do we serve them well there, not offend them? You gave a couple stories of offending. So how do we develop that relationship and really serve those families well and early on, before it's really developed, before a church has really had a lot of experience with it?
So, and this is where I say that disability ministry is about relationship. And it's asking family questions. It's okay. And when you talk about, not offending someone, I mean, let's imagine that you have a family who has a child with autism and they come and they visit the church, and the church is really on board saying, we want to love this family really well. You could say, hey, let us know what we can do to help. Or you could really hold on to that relational aspect and say, hey, let's say it's the senior pastor or the children's pastor. We're so glad you're here. Would you guys want to come over to my house and have dinner? How does that work for your son? Yes, no. Well, we would love to get together. I want to get to know you. I want to get to know your son. I want you to help me include your son. It's okay. It's perfectly okay for a volunteer or for the pastor or whoever's making those connections to say, I don't really know a lot about disability, but I really want to learn. If I say something offensive, will you please let me know? Because I don't want to do that. Can you teach me? And that willingness to learn is what's going to make all the difference. Because there's a difference between saying, well, I don't think we can help your child because we don't know how to deal with, you could say, an outburst. We don't, or to say we don't know how to deal with a child who can't communicate verbally. So we're not equipped for that. And I don't think we can help you. As opposed to saying, I don't feel very comfortable when I talk to people who are nonverbal, but I really want to learn. So could you help me learn how to communicate with your child? What works for him? So there's a difference between a willingness to learn and then a willingness to change than to say right off the bat, this is not going to work for us at all. So once you get to that, it's really, being willing to learn. Now, going more to practical things that we can do, there are three of my favorite ways to approach disability ministry. One, I love the one-on-one helpers, the buddy system. When you have a child who needs a little bit more care, to get someone to be with them one-on-one so they can redirect them, or if the child needs a break, they can go with them and they can be safe. Whatever you need, whatever they need to have that one-on-one support so that the parents can be in church and be fed, because it's important for the parents to hear God's word too. So the one-on-one is probably my favorite way, or my favorite, my favorite way to include kids with disabilities. For example, my kids, my daughter who has Down syndrome and my daughter who has cerebral palsy, they can participate in children's ministries and they do not need a one-on-one helper. Not all kids need that. So in our children's ministry, we had several kids who did need that one-on-one. And we really created such an organic way of how things worked that we even had some kids, older kids, offer support to the younger kids, which was really beautiful to watch.
Yeah.
because the kids were learning from the beginning. Another thing that, let's say that you're in a situation where there's not a lot of volunteers, you already have your hands full and you're thinking, what can we do? Creating a sensory room can be a good first step. So a sensory room would be that you choose a room at your church that is going to be used specifically for kids who have sensory issues, which some kids with disabilities do. And a sensory room, you're going to have, low lights and maybe a Lycra swing or a platform swing. And maybe you're going to have fiber optics and lights, no flashing lights because those can, cause seizures in kids who have seizure disorders. So I never encourage any flashing lights, just really dim lights, maybe like waves or like a little stars, squishy toys, things that are going to be, the tactile encouragement, something they can squeeze, something they can pull, something they can bend, maybe a rocking chair or a rocking board, a crash pad, a padded place, maybe textures. If you have like different rugs that they can feel on the floor, that kind of a sensory room. So think dim lights, heavenly, because in our sensory room, it was not unusual to have the parents at the end of the service go and hang out in the sensory room, and you would walk in and it was actually quiet. Because it is so calming. So having a sensory room that's going to help calm down and regulate a child is really important. And the other thing I mentioned is fidgets. A lot of kids, and right now, those spinners are all the rave in school.
Yeah.
And
at church. I was just one of the kids at our church yesterday had one.
Yes.
And it was funny because he was telling me, he's like 7 years old, and he was telling me it's funny because sometimes in some ways they do the opposite of what they're designed to do. The idea that like he doesn't pay attention. Yeah. It was funny.
Yes. So, and I will tell you why, because there's a difference into a child who needs a toy like that and a child who doesn't, and a child who doesn't, it becomes a toy. Yeah. A child who does need it, it does become a sensory tool. So that's how you can gauge it. If you have a child that's just getting distracted, it's just a toy. But if you have a child who's using it and benefiting from it, they do need it. So if you have a little basket full of, trinkets like that, it's great. So you can hand that to them. Some people recommend having like therapy balls, but I don't recommend therapy balls because it takes a while for a child, even a child with a disability, to learn how to use a therapy ball effectively and to not be bouncing off the walls and just get more agitated. So what I do like, however, they make those little cushions that are like filled with air. Yeah. And those are great because you can bounce, but it gives you, there's enough give that kids can move a little bit and wiggle without being out of control. Sometimes even having in the corner, having a tent that's mostly dark, maybe with a flashlight inside or something, with some pillows, so that if a kid needs to take a break, they can go and take a break. A lot of kids know when they need to take a break. And as adults, we can learn, once we get to know the kids, if the kid gets to a point where they do need to take a break. So kind of incorporating those things. And I was telling you before that I encourage churches to reach out to special ed teachers, to occupational therapists, or even physical therapists who work at the school. Now, most special ed teachers that I know, they went into the profession because they really wanted to help kids with disabilities. They have such a heart to serve kids with disabilities. But then they get to school, and then you have to deal with the red tape of school and with the testing and with charts and all the things that they end up doing that take away from what they really wanted to do. But as a church, and I haven't had one church call me and say it didn't work. If you call one of them and you say, hey, we have a couple of kids with disabilities here at church, and I was wondering if you would be willing to come, look at our space, look at what we have, and give us some ideas of what we can do to help the child. I don't know of one teacher who has said no, because they finally get to go and do what they actually really wanted to do.
Yeah, without the red tape, or at least most of the red tape.
Yes, and I've heard of some of those teachers who even volunteered. Like, oh, this is what you can do. Well, I'll stay. I'll come a few Sundays and I'll stay and I'll help you so you can figure it out, which who doesn't want that, right?
Yeah.
And some of them that then even started then coming to their church regularly. So right there's an outreach you can have in your community.
Yeah, that's
and
great.
Now, my favorite approach to disability ministry, because again, it's relational, it's a small group model. A lot of churches have small groups. And I would say most churches probably have small groups, and whether they call them cell groups or small groups or family groups or, the different creative names that people come up with. If each group adopted one family who has a child with a disability, and that family becomes like, again, your family with the church, from there, you got all the volunteers, all the one-on-one volunteers you need for a specific child. You got even the babysitters for the family who has a child with a disability. You got the grandparents, quote unquote, for those kids with disabilities. So a small group model is really, really my favorite, especially when you have people of different ages. So you could have kids the same age as the kids with disabilities, and those peer relationships are so important both ways. You can have teenagers who can babysit or be one-on-one helpers with a child with a disability during church. You have adults who can also be the one-on-one helpers with a child with a disability during church. And because you're getting together outside of church, you're actually really getting to know that family. So that is my favorite model of disability ministry.
Yeah, that's good. That's good because it's a lot as opposed to maybe the buddy model. You're really providing a whole group like a family, like you said.
Yeah,
so they're both good, but I can see where if you can have a small group approach to it, it's just even more care, even more friendship, co-laborers, the whole thing.
Yes, and really the reality is that a lot of special needs families go through a lot of crises, and when you have a whole small group who can come around and help you right away, what a difference it makes. And not just for the family with disability. I mean, you can be in a small group and, a tragedy could happen to one of the other members. And it also gives the opportunity for the family impacted by disability to be able to serve someone else and to help someone else. Because, and maybe this is where I pause and I say, yes, a lot of families impacted by disability are needy. But if we support a family enough as a church, they will find health. And when you have healthy families, those parents and those kids, whoever they are, they have gifts and talents and they have something to contribute to your church. And I've always said, yes, maybe you're going to take a volunteer from church. I'm not going to say take someone, but you're going to have someone do a one-on-one with a child with Down syndrome. But now you have two parents who are so passionate about youth ministry that you get two of your best youth volunteers. So that's part of doing life together as a church. And really, church should be that way, right? It's supposed to be a family, feeling.
Yeah, definitely. So in either model, if you have if you're doing the buddy system model, if it's a small group model, you're going to have people who could use training and help in being buddies. So how do you recommend churches approach that? Is it going back to, bringing those people in from the outside again, who would probably be willing to help? Or is it a mix of things? How do you think churches could approach training their team members to serve families with disabilities well?
So it's a mix of things. One, just remember that the parents had no training and then they had their kids. So
on the job training.
Yes. So
like all parenting.
Really, exactly. So it's not really, there's no particular training. I've always said the only time where you really are going to need to have someone who's very well trained and really well qualified is if you have the case of having a medically fragile kid, in which case you probably want to find a nurse to be the one-on-one buddy in case anything happened.
Yeah.
If you have a child who has very severe, and I don't like to use that word, but if they have outbursts and it becomes a safety issue for other children, in that situation, it would be important to have some training, at which point I would really hope that parents would be upfront with a church. And I think most of them would be. And in that situation, maybe you would need a little bit of training. And sometimes in very extreme cases like that, parents bring trained professionals with them. So I have a lot of friends who bring respite service providers to church with them because their child has very significant behaviors or needs. So very few parents are going to expect you to provide those very specific needs for a child when even as parents they need help. Okay, so I say that because sometimes we do think about disability ministry and we think that we need training and that nobody's qualified. Again, disability ministry is about relationships. So the same way that you would talk to any 5-year-old is how you talk to a 5-year-old with a disability, even if they are nonverbal, even if they have Down syndrome, autism, cerebral palsy, or are a little girl who's a drama queen. Now, that said, I mean, that's just for people who feel like they would never, be qualified enough or have the skills required to do disability ministry. Anyone really could do disability ministry. But again, that said, training is really important. One, as we talk, to understand disability, because if you have great volunteers that have a great heart, but they're in the pity stage, well, that's not ideal, right? Because we need them not to be at the pity stage and to move towards care, at least to move towards care, if not friendship and collaborating. So it is really important. And one, it has to start with leadership. If leadership is not completely behind it, it's really, really hard to see any disability ministry take shape. Now, I do have great recommendations for training. Johnny and Friends, if people are familiar with Johnny and Friends, most people do know about Johnny Erickson Tata. She is a quadriplegic after she had an accident. And for those who grew up in the church, you might have watched her movie, you have heard her sing, you have heard her speak, her and her husband maybe. I mean, she's pretty well known. And she started an organization called Johnny and Friends. And what they do is that they provide support, training, outreach, mission trip, you name it, family retreats to people impacted by disability. So there are several offices from Johnny and Friends throughout the U.S. So the headquarters, the Johnny and Friends headquarters, are in California. But for example, there's an office in Chicago, there's an office in Minnesota, there's one in North Carolina, there's one in Ohio. So there's a lot of different offices. So you can contact your local Johnny and Friends. And most offices have someone in the position of church relations management. So these are the people who would go and do training for your church. And Johnny and Friends, I would say it's one of the most respected organizations. And I'm just honored that I get to partner with them and work with them to different capacities. So they do a great job for any type of training that you need to do with your church, training your volunteers, training your church as a whole. They are my number one recommendation for any church. Just get familiar with Johnny and Friends. And actually, for any pastors or leadership, my husband was a pastor for 13 years. He didn't take even one class when it comes to disability. So the reality is that we have these pastors with great hearts, but they never got any theological training when it comes to disability. And Johnny and Friends, through the Christian Institute of Disability, they actually offer a class called Beyond Suffering that is phenomenal. I've gone through the class, and I wish every school training pastors offer that class. Again, that's besides the point. So there's Johnny and Friends. Now, when it comes to mental illness, Key Ministry is incredible. It was founded, and the president is Steve Gersovich, who is a child and adolescent psychiatrist, actually very well respected in the world of psychiatry. And he leads Key Ministry. So anything relating to mental illness, whether it be for adults or for children, if you want to tackle mental illness in your church first, Key Ministry is your go-to for mental illness. And then I will offer my services, because what I do is that I go and I help churches embrace disability, and whether that's consultation, whether that's doing disability awareness Sundays, whether that's doing training with volunteers. I like to do full church trainings, because if only a few people get it, you can only get so far with a disability ministry, but when you have all the church on board, that's what really makes a difference. So I am available for that as well.
That's great. And we'll link to your site and those other sites you mentioned. And on your site too, you list, the various types of training that you can do, conversations, things like that, which is great. Mm-hmm. So we'll link to all of those, which I think would be helpful, because I know people are looking for ways to train, their team. And even the 5 stages alone, just presenting that, not having, just presenting that alone is probably really helpful from a training perspective.
Too, all the time. Yeah. And it's great that you're going to link, but it's really easy. JohnnyandFriends.org, keyministry.org, whydisabilitymatters.org.
Yep. And Johnny is Joni and
yes.
Friends.
Yes.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Well, this is really helpful, and I'm glad that you're spending time here on the podcast with us talking about this. You're also speaking at the group Kidmin Conference this fall, correct? And doing a couple breakouts related to this, which is great. We'll link to that as well in the show notes. But for anybody that wants to connect with you, ellenstumbo.com, what else should they know to be able to connect? If they want to email or follow you on social media?
Yep. So you can email me at ellen@ellenstumbo.com. Ellenstumbo.com is my website that I do for parents who have kids with disabilities. Ellen@whydisabilitymatters.org. That's my email for disability ministry. And whydisabilitymatters.org, that's my website where you will find what I do to help churches, really. So that's a good way to get a hold of me. Great. And I'm on Facebook, so you can also go on Facebook, either find me or find Disability Matters. And Johnny and Friends is there too, and Key Ministry is there too. So
that's awesome. We'll link to all that stuff. Well, this has been really, really helpful. I know this is I feel like it's something that a lot of church leaders struggle with, and you could maybe put it in the ignorance column, not in a bad way, but just don't know. Kind of like you said you were. Before
you just don't know.
You just don't know. So this has been really, really helpful, and I appreciate you taking the time to share with us today. And, I look forward to hearing about how things go at the group Kidmin Conference. I'm sure you'll help a lot of leaders there as well. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was great being here today.
Yep. Thanks, Ellen. I don't know about you, but I found that to be incredibly helpful. The levels that she shared, I think were just eye-opening to me, and I could totally see where we could be in there level-wise and think that we're doing a great job and we're viewing this the right way, and totally not really be where we need to be. And so I thought that was helpful. I love the practical steps she shared that we can take as churches, and of course, as it should be in ministry, it's all about relationships, isn't it? Everything is, and I love how she pointed back to that. Here's some action items. I think the easy thing would be to first determine where your church is in those levels. What level is your church on? And then figure out what is one step we can take to move towards the next level as a church. I think sometimes with a lot of things, but especially when in this conversation, we think too much about what it would look like to have maybe a whole ministry to serve families that have disabilities. And a lot of churches do, many of you do, and that's great. But many of you listening don't have that, and you probably think that might be the answer. And really, we can just start kind of like Ellen said, with a family and a relationship, and pour in there and just go from there. So be sure to get all the show notes, the links that she mentioned to those resources at nickblevins.com/episode 59. And as always, I hope you'll subscribe. I hope this is valuable to you. I hope you'll leave a rating and a review on iTunes. That's really helpful. If you do subscribe, then next week you'll hear my interview with Amber Baker. Amber and I talk about the Real Colors personality test, how she uses it with her children's ministry team, and we talk about women in ministry. Amber was the first ordained female pastor at her church, which is really, really cool. We talk about that and some of the barriers to that in church world for women serving in ministry. So you don't want to miss that. Be sure to subscribe as always, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.